in these made real and concrete, so that a higher version is a flatter face. So people start measuring this sort of thing. And who has more flat faces? Europeans. So it turns out that, interestingly, from this perspective, that the laws of progress, culture, maps nicely onto the laws of science, onto what we know about the natural world. So they argue. Now, there's another version of this story, too, and I just want to say not everyone held this view. And there was every one of these things generates another view. So this is by an important French anthropological sculptor. He worked for the Musée de l'Homme. He worked for an anthropological museum, and he sculpted the peoples of the world. And he actually rendered, this is obviously an anti-slavery statue. Why was I born a slave? This harkens back to the pictures I showed you earlier of Equiano and of Sanchez and of these British black slaves who look just like British gentlemen. So racism produces a counter-racist discourse at the same version, just as the claims of equality produce the racist discourse. Well, 5, nationalism. This would be, if this were a European history course, I would give you a much, much, much bigger story of how the national aspirations of the late 19th century pushed empire. But the basic story is that what happens in the late 19th century, 1870 to be exact, is that Germany is unified and Germany becomes this great dominant European power, which terrifies the British, who were before the power, and the French, who were beaten in a war in order to make this possible. And there's a great deal of national fervor saying if we're going to remain strong and a powerful nation, we need to act like a strong and powerful nation. Look, the British have an empire. We need an empire too. The French have an empire. So Belgium needs an empire. Even the Germans need an empire, even though Bismarck, their leader, says we don't need an empire. So having an empire is sort of becomes part of the national the nationalist European project in the context of European rivalries and claims of national self-assertion. So European armies increase, European navies increase, and they project themselves around the world. So this is going to be an important part of our story. The British may be perfectly happy to let, in some cases, let Leopold have the Congo, just as long as the French are excluded. And all of them would like to exclude the Portuguese, and so forth. So again, this is just a place filler for a much bigger history, but you have to understand what's happening in Africa is a projection of European national rivalries. And the last point really goes back to my first point about history and progress, that folks really thought, and Kurtz represents this in some way, that they are on the side of history. The imperial project is the project of history, capital H. Not a history like we study, this is a part history course, but history as the universal story. History is the way the world moves, right? Okay, now, we've talked about ideologies of empire. What has this actually produced? What happens with empire? Well, you saw the division, the politics of the division of Africa. It affects the whole world in a way that we live with every day and that we read about in the newspapers. So it changes local political ecologies. In other words, the fact that the Ottoman Empire is weak in Egypt allows the British to take over, to enforce a certain debt, payment of a debt. The fact that the British are now there and more of the local elite are being educated in Western notions of nationalism produces Egyptian nationalism with a particular sort of rhetoric, which produces a different sort of nationalism. So there's a secular nationalism and there's a Islamicist nationalism. The roots of the current story are around. And that's just one country. And that's true. Every country of this, that grows out of this imperial world has these new local ecologies that grow out of the European, new political ecologies that grow out of the European conquest. Every country starts having a European educated elite. Many of them are Christian. right? Changes the local ecology. Those of you who read at Chibean High School, Things Fall Apart, get a good sense of that. The second part is changes in local gender relationships. We'll talk a little bit about this next week. In the African case, we're reading the chapter of Tabitha Kanogo's book on clitoridectomy, but there are the chapters on dower and bride price and all these sort of notions in which the British administrators have to decide whether to enforce local custom or what they take to be British versions of these, how to regulate intimate relationships. And it's not as if it's the British versus Africans. Lots of African women would very much like to get out of these certain situations. They'd like, when they leave their husbands, not to have to give back all the goats, or whatever was paid in these bridal negotiations. And all that, if you read more of her book, you'll see, I'll have the citation next lecture. The imperial powers insert themselves into the local gender politics. You see this a lot. You see, another great place to see it is the case of Egypt. So in Egypt, the first male nationalists on the side of progress, on the side of what they take to be a European version of gender stories, make the case that women ought not to wear the veil because wearing the veil represents the old Ottoman anti-modernity. The great heroes in their story are peasant women who don't wear the veil and who are out there in labor and do important things versus the layabouts and the harem. A lot of women don't like this story, and there's an opposition to this story. Later Egyptian feminist women, important, the founding Egyptian feminist movement, argue, no, one ought to give up the veil. And the most important Egyptian feminist gives this up in 1923. It was Hoda Shawari. She found schools for girls, she set a modern curriculum, and so forth. And then, of course, the story becomes murkier and more difficult when that particular version of modernity ends. So Turkey is a place where you see this being worked out right now. In this sort of case in which the founder of Turkey said, we need to be Western, men can't wear fezzes, women can't wear veils, because that's old-fashioned. That's the old historical story. We're moving with the new history. And then what happens? Well, you get a different version of history, which is being debated today. So all I want to point out to you is that these imperial enterprise goes at every level of the culture and fractures each of these cultures. So it's deeply rooted, and we still live with it. It changes local religious configurations. So when we talk about Nigeria in this little while, we have a Christian area and a Muslim area, which are importantly in conflict in the post-colonial wars. And furthermore, and the last point is it creates the situation of what I would say is both everyday and exceptional violence. Maintaining a domination of this large number of people by a small number of imperial administrators is a violent enterprise. It's a terribly violent enterprise, just at its level of policing. And the wars of they're wars in which there's vast technological inequalities between the British with modern rifles and Africans coming at them with spears. There's daily the different legal codes for natives and for native peoples and for the colonial people, harsher legal codes. So at every level, the violence is embedded at the level of conquering and keeping power, and at the level of policing. It's a tremendously, in the interest of progress and civilization, an enormous amount of violence is done. Now, that brings you to the anti-imperialism, just very briefly, because the story we're telling is sort of part of the anti-imperialist story as much as the imperialist story. The Second World War is effectively the end of the Age of Empire. The imperial powers had basically weakened by the war. One of them's defeated, Japan. The Dutch have lost their empire to the Japanese and aren't going to get it back. The French have lost it somewhat, the Japanese too, in the case of Vietnam and Indochina. We have different stories in different parts of the world. India has had a long independence struggle, very much rooted in Western notions of of constitutionalism and which I'll talk to you about in a moment. So there is decolonization. Decolonization in itself produces all new levels of violence.